You should give those scraps to the dog." Karen said it with a smile, gesturing at my plate with her wineglass. The kitchen went quiet for a moment, that particular silence that happens when someone says something cruel enough to freeze the air. My son Michael didn't look up from his phone. My granddaughter Sophie stopped chewing. The steak in front of me had been cut small, the way I'd learnt to eat since my jaw surgery 3 years ago, the surgery Michael never visited me for. The surgery I recovered from alone in this house that I'd paid off 20 years before either of them was born. I am 74 years old. I have lived in this house for 46 years, raised 2 children in these rooms, buried my husband Robert from the front porch, and somehow, somewhere along the way, I became invisible. Not invisible like a ghost, but invisible like furniture, something to be used, something that was simply expected to be there. Karen reached for the bread basket, still smiling, waiting for me to laugh along with her joke the way I always did, the way I'd been trained to do through 8 years of small humiliations at my own dinner table. But something shifted. Maybe it was the way she'd said scraps, that word rolling off her tongue like I was already something less than human. Maybe it was the surgery scar beneath my jaw that still ached when the weather changed, the reminder of how alone I'd been in that hospital room with its antiseptic smell and cold sheets, waiting for a son who never came. Or maybe it was simply that after 7 decades of living, a person reaches a moment when the weight of their own silence becomes unbearable. I set down my fork with careful precision. The clink of metal against my mother's china sounded impossibly loud in that quiet kitchen, the kitchen where I had cooked approximately 11,000 meals for people who had stopped seeing me as a person. Then I did something I had never done before. I reached across the table, lifted Karen's untouched ribeye from her plate with deliberate slowness, walked to where our golden retriever Biscuit lay on his bed by the back door, and placed the steak directly in front of him. $12 a pound. Organic. The kind Karen insisted on. No one spoke. I returned to my chair, picked up my fork, and continued eating my small, carefully cut pieces as though nothing had happened at all. My hands were steady, though my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish discovering air for the first time. Michael finally looked up from his phone, confusion spreading across his face like a stain, the same face I had nursed through chicken pox and homework and a broken heart when Jennifer Holloway rejected him at senior prom. Sophie was watching me with something new in her eyes, recognition perhaps, or hope. The meal finished in silence. They left without helping clear the dishes, which was not unusual, but this time the quiet felt different. It felt like mine. That night I could not sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the house settle around me, the creaks and groans I had memorized over decades, the sounds of a life I had built and maintained and somehow lost ownership of. My mind kept returning to a manila folder in the bottom drawer of Robert's old desk. The folder I had been adding to for 15 years, documenting every loan that was never repaid, every payment I had made on their behalf, every promise Michael made and broke. $247,000. I had counted it once, then closed the folder and put it away because the number made me feel like a fool. At 6 a.m, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink, watching the sun come up through windows I had cleaned myself for 46 years. The folder lay open in front of me now, spread across the oak surface my mother had given me as a wedding gift in 1978. The numbers told a story I had refused to read. Down payment on Michael's first house, 2003. $42,000. New roof when Karen complained about the water stain in their guest bathroom, 2011. $18,000. Private school tuition for grandchildren I was allowed to see on holidays and birthdays when it was convenient, when they needed someone to watch the kids so they could go skiing in Vermont. $83,000 over 6 years. The list continued for 3 pages in my careful handwriting. Each entry a small surrender I had made in exchange for the illusion that I was still part of a family. I had believed, in some deep and stupid part of myself, that generosity would make them love me, that if I gave enough, I would stop being invisible. My phone buzzed against the table. A text from Michael. Karen says you embarrassed her last night. What's going on with you? I read it 3 times. Not an apology, not concern, just Karen says, as though his wife's embarrassment mattered more than whatever had driven his mother to act so strangely after 7 decades of compliance. I did not respond. The silence that followed was vast and heavy, pressing against my ribs like something physical. I had spent so many years filling silence with accommodation, with yes and of course and it's no trouble at all, that its absence felt almost suffocating. But beneath the weight, something else, something that might have been relief. Sophie called that afternoon while I was repotting the orchid Robert had given me on our last anniversary, the one I had somehow kept alive through 8 years of widowhood while everything else seemed to wither. "Grandma," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. I fed a steak to a dog." "You finally stood up for yourself. That's different." She was 23, my Sophie, working her first real job at a marketing firm downtown, still young enough to believe that the world could change if you pushed hard enough. She had Robert's eyes, that same steady gaze that seemed to see through pretense. "How long has it been like this?" she asked. I thought about the question for a long moment, my hands still covered in potting soil, the phone pressed between my shoulder and ear the way I used to hold it when the children were small and demanded constant attention. "I don't remember when it started," I finally admitted. "One day you're helping your son buy his first home because you want him to succeed, And 15 years later, you're sitting at your own dinner table being told to eat dog food. The monthly transfers, Sophie said carefully. The credit card payments. You're still doing all of that, aren't you? I said nothing. Grandma, you need to stop. That night, the phone buzzed 11 times between 7 and midnight. I watched the screen illuminate in the darkness of my bedroom, casting brief blue shadows across the ceiling, but I did not pick it up. Karen's name, Michael's name, a rhythm of increasingly frantic messages I could read without opening. We need to talk. This is ridiculous. You're being childish. Mum, call me back. Fine, be that way. By morning, they had stopped. The silence returned, different now, still heavy, but somehow my own. I sat in Robert's chair by the window, something I had never allowed myself to do since his death because it felt like trespassing on his memory, and watched the birds at the feeder he had built. The leather still smelled faintly of him, Old Spice and pipe tobacco, and something underneath that I could only call Robert. I had been so afraid of this silence, I had filled every corner of my life with service and sacrifice to avoid exactly this moment, sitting alone in an empty house with nothing but my own thoughts for company. But the thoughts, I discovered, were not unkind. They were tired. They were sad. But underneath the exhaustion and grief, there was something else. A small, stubborn voice that had been waiting decades to be heard. Enough. The bank was cold, the way all banks are cold. That aggressive air conditioning that seems designed to remind you that money is serious business. I had dressed carefully that morning in the blue cardigan Robert always liked, the one I usually saved for holidays, and I carried the manila folder against my chest like armour. The young woman at the customer service desk had bright eyes and a name tag that read Jennifer, and she could not have been older than Sophie. She looked at me the way young people often look at elderly women, with that mixture of politeness and impatience that assumes I would need help understanding simple things. I need to make several changes to my accounts, I said, placing the folder on her desk. I want to cancel all automatic transfers to this account number. I slid a piece of paper across to her. I also want to remove Michael Patterson as a joint holder on my savings account, and I need to open a trust fund. Jennifer blinked. A trust fund? For my granddaughter, Sophie Patterson, I have all the documentation here. I opened the folder and began removing papers with a steadiness that surprised me. I'd also like to speak with someone about setting up a living trust for estate planning purposes. Something shifted in Jennifer's expression. The impatience faded, replaced by something that might have been respect. "Let me get our senior advisor," she said. The advisor, a man named Thomas Wright with grey temples and kind eyes, walked me through every form with patience and precision. He did not ask why. He did not suggest I reconsider. He simply witnessed as I signed document after document with careful strokes, my mother's handwriting that I had inherited along with the kitchen table. When I walked out of the bank 90 minutes later, the transfers that had automatically moved $1,800 from my account to Michael's every month for the past 6 years were cancelled. The joint account that had given my son access to my savings, the account I had opened when he was 16 and never thought to close, was now solely mine. The sun felt different on my face when I stepped outside, warmer. My lawyer's office was 3 blocks away, in a building I had passed hundreds of times without ever entering. Margaret Chen was a woman of about 50 who wore her competence like a well-fitted suit, and she did not waste time with pleasantries. "You want to change your will," she said, scanning the documents I had brought. "I want to leave everything to my granddaughter Sophie, the house, the investments, the accounts, all of it. Michael is to receive nothing." Margaret's pen paused over her notepad. "That's your prerogative, of course, but I'm required to advise you that disinheriting a child can sometimes be contested." "On what grounds?" "Lack of mental capacity is the usual claim, that the parent wasn't of sound mind when they made the change." I sat very still for a moment, feeling the weight of those words. How convenient it would be for Michael. How perfectly it would fit the narrative he would certainly construct. Mother had become confused. Mother didn't know what she was doing. Mother needed to be protected from herself. "Then we should document my capacity thoroughly," I said. "I want this will to be unbreakable. I want it witnessed by someone who can testify to my mental state, and I want the reasons recorded." Margaret set down her pen and looked at me directly for the first time. "Mrs. Patterson, may I ask what prompted this decision?" $247,000, I said. "And a steak dinner." She didn't ask for clarification. Perhaps she didn't need to. The paperwork took 2 hours. I signed my name 43 times. When it was finished, Margaret handed me copies of everything in a new folder, this one clean and unmarked. "These documents are now legally binding," she said. "I'll file the originals with the court. Is there anything else?" "Yes, I'd like your card in case my son decides to contest anything." She smiled just slightly. "I look forward to that conversation, Mrs. Patterson." I did not go home immediately. Instead, I walked to the small park 2 blocks from the town centre, the one with the bench overlooking the pond where Robert and I used to feed the ducks on Sunday morning. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun, and I sat for a long time watching the water and thinking about nothing at all. My phone had been buzzing in my purse all day. I took it out and looked at the screen without reading the messages. 17 texts, 4 missed calls, 1 voicemail. I turned it off. The silence that followed was different from any silence I had known. It was not the heavy silence of loneliness or the anxious silence of waiting for someone to need me. It was simply quiet. The sound of my own breathing, the rustle of wind through leaves, a dog barking somewhere in the distance. For the first time in 8 years, I was not waiting for anything. Karen arrived 3 days later without calling first, which was not unusual because she had never thought to call first, had never considered that I might have plans or preferences about visitors in my own home. I was in the garden when her car pulled into the driveway, pulling weeds from the flower bed Robert had planted 30 years ago. My hands covered in good dark earth. She did not get out of the car immediately. I watched through the garden fence as she checked her reflection in the mirror, adjusted her hair, composed her face into an expression of concerned sympathy, the performance of a caring daughter-in-law about to stage an intervention. I kept pulling weeds. When she finally approached, her heels sinking slightly into the lawn she had always complained was too soft, her voice was carefully modulated, sweet, reasonable, the voice she used when she wanted something. "Eleanor, we need to talk about what's been happening. Michael and I are worried about you." I did not stand up. I did not invite her inside. I simply continued working, feeling the soil beneath my fingernails, the sun on the back of my neck. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but there's nothing to discuss." The bank called Michael about the accounts. "They shouldn't have. He's no longer authorized on those accounts." Her composure cracked, just slightly, a tightening around the eyes. "What is going on with you? You've been acting completely irrational. First the dinner, now this." I sat back on my heels and looked up at her, really looked, seeing her clearly perhaps for the first time. The careful makeup and expensive highlights, the designer bag I had probably paid for through some loan Michael had asked for and never repaid. The absolute certainty in her eyes that she was dealing with a confused old woman who simply needed to be managed. "Karen," I said quietly, "I think you should go home now. I'm not leaving until we sort this out. Michael is devastated." Michael is inconvenienced. There's a difference. I stood slowly, brushing the dirt from my knees. "I have given your family $247,000 over 15 years. I have never been thanked. I have been told to eat dog scraps at my own dinner table. And now you are standing in my garden demanding that I continue to fund a lifestyle while accepting disrespect. I'm not finished." My voice was steady, not loud, not angry, simply firm in a way it had never been before. "The money is gone. The access is gone. My will has been changed. If you would like to rebuild some kind of relationship, it will be on different terms. Terms that include basic human respect. But that conversation will happen when I choose to have it, not when you show up unannounced on my lawn." She stared at me for a long moment, mouth slightly open, and I saw the calculation happening behind her eyes, the strategies forming and dissolving as she realized that none of her usual approaches would work here. Guilt would not work. Manipulation would not work. Threats would not work. I had nothing left to lose and nothing left to prove. "This isn't over," she said finally. "Yes," I said, "it is." She left. The tires of her car spat gravel as she reversed out of the driveway, and then there was silence again, the good silence I was learning to trust. Michael came the following evening. His approach was different from Karen's, softer somehow, and for a moment standing in my doorway he looked like the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, afraid of the noise. "Mum," he said, "what do I need to do?" I let him in. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table, my mother's table, and I told him. I told him about the folder and the numbers and the years of feeling like I existed only to provide. I told him about Karen's comment and what it had broken loose in me. I told him that I loved him, that I would always love him, but that love did not mean I would continue to disappear. He cried. Whether from genuine remorse or simply from the shock of consequences finally arriving, I could not tell. Perhaps both. "I didn't realize," he kept saying. "I didn't see it." "No," I agreed, "you didn't." I did not offer forgiveness because forgiveness was not mine to give yet. I told him that if he wanted a relationship with me, it would need to be built from scratch, on foundation of mutual respect, rather than automatic access to my resources and my time. He would need to show me, not tell me, and it would take as long as it took. He nodded. He left. And the silence he left behind was complicated, threaded with grief and relief in equal measure, but it was still mine. A month has passed. The rumors reached me eventually, carried on the wind of small-town gossip. Eleanor is losing her mind. Eleanor has become cruel in her old age. Can you believe what she did to her own son? I let the words wash over me and continued tending my garden. Continued reading the books I had been meaning to read for decades. Continued learning who I was without the constant weight of being needed. Sophie visits every Sunday now. We drink tea at the kitchen table and talk about her work, her hopes, her worries about the world. She never asks for money. She brings flowers sometimes, or bread she baked herself, small offerings that expect nothing in return. This is what family can look like, I am learning. This is what it should have looked like all along. Michael's letter arrived last week. 2 pages, handwritten, which must have taken him hours since he hasn't written anything by hand since high school. He apologized. Not the quick, convenient apology I had feared, but something slower, something that acknowledged specifics. He asked if we might meet for coffee sometime, just the 2 of us, to begin again. I have not decided yet. The letter sits on Robert's desk, next to the empty folder that once held 15 years of evidence of my own erasure. I will answer when I am ready, if I am ever ready. The choice is mine. If you recognize yourself in this story, if you are the one who always gives and never receives, who swallows cruelty because the alternative feels like selfishness, I want you to know something. Your boundaries are not a betrayal. Your silence is not kindness when it costs you your own dignity. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to be seen. You are allowed, even now, especially now, to say no. This evening I sit in Robert's chair by the window, watching the light fade from gold to purple over the garden we built together. The phone is silent because I have chosen silence. The house is quiet because the quiet is finally mine. I am 74 years old and I have just begun to live.